let's go to the next talk quickly. I'm going to introduce our awesome speaker, next speaker. I have to say this name very fast, she said. So let's try it out. Yuraima. So she is our next awesome speaker. So did it good?
You got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Amazing.
Okay. So very welcome. Yuraima actually is an engineer manager in New York Times, if I'm not mistaken, and she's also organizer of Use React New York, right?
Yeah, definitely.
That's fantastic. And you love pets. Apparently, you're a dog lover.
I'm a dog lover. I think I said that my superpower was making sure I said hello to every single dog I see on the street. And I truly do mean
Oh,
every single dog.
oh, fantastic. I'm also a dog lover. I have a small dog, so I bet you will like to meet him maybe one day
Yeah.
in person when we come to Verona
Yeah.
after this
100%.
situation. But, I'm always wondering, because I'm a lazy developer, I was wondering how can I do good without doing nothing? And then I saw your talk and said, "Oh, this is absolutely fantastic. This is my thing. I want to see this for sure." And I'm glad that you are here to tell us how can we do good without doing nothing. So, stage is yours. Welcome.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Yuraima Estevez. I am an engineering manager over at the New York Times. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I get started. If anyone wants to take a look at these slides while I'm going through them, you can find them at the website below. It's at a11y-testing.uraima.com. And if you want to hit me up with some questions on Twitter, feel free to find me at Yurm04. So again, today we're going to be talking about one of my absolute favorite topics, accessibility. And accessibility is one of my favorite topics because it's all about our users, every single one of our users, and making sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate on the web, in our mobile apps, and a little bit more generally in society. And it ensures this regardless of a person's circumstance, ability, or disability. Now, web accessibility in particular is about keeping the web inclusive. It's about making sure that we don't gatekeep certain populations of people, but this is what tends to happen if we aren't intentional about building our apps so that they are able to work for everyone. But it's really not enough to just stop worrying about accessibility after the build phase, because there's so much more work that has to go into our apps after we push them out to production. There's maintenance, bug fixes, and feature development. And every single time that we make a change to our code bases, we know that we open up ourselves up to bugs and regressions. But this is more or less a solved problem, right? We've found ways to protect ourselves from unintentionally creating bugs or unintentionally degrading user experiences. And we've done this generally through testing. And we've even managed to cut down on the time it takes to run these tests and other processes through automation. So if we build out our components and apps as accessibly as possible, and we write some tests against their behavior to validate that we can guard against bugs, and then we find opportunities to automate all of this through some processes in our accessibility development cycle, then we can save a lot of time and build a ton of confidence in our systems that will end up making sure that we build them so that they work for everyone. And then consequently, we end up making the web better for everyone. And this will allow us to sleep more soundly, knowing that we've built and kept our applications inclusive with just a little bit of effort in the beginning and very little effort in the long run. And eventually, it'll be almost as if we can say that we'll be doing a lot of good without doing anything at all, sort of. So to kick it off, we're going to break this talk down into two parts. First, we're going to talk about some tools that we can use at different stages of our development process. And these are tools that are going to help automate some of the harder tasks that we often have to do in order to keep our code bases free of accessibility bugs. And then we're going to talk about testing. And these are going to be the kinds of tests that we write and the things that we want to validate when it comes to our accessibility support in our components and in our apps. Now, before we jump into tools and testing, I do want to share two small disclaimers. The first one is that you really do need to have a pretty good foundation for both accessibility and testing before we go into this talk. I make a lot of assumptions to make sure that you have a good enough grasp of accessibility and testing concepts, enough so that you understand some practices, best practices, common lingo, and syntax. So if you do need a primer on accessibility, I actually linked here a recorded talk that I did at the beginning of the year, and that'll give you just enough that you need to know to make it through this rest of the talk. And then the second disclaimer I have is that most of my examples are in React. I primarily work in React, so you're going to see a lot of React today. But almost everything that I say in this talk can easily be translated to the language, the framework, or the library of your choice. The implementation details are definitely going to be specific to your own code bases, but you can use the strategies in this talk to help guide those decisions on how you can make a path forward for yourselves and for your own code bases. So, disclaimers out of the way, let's jump right into our tools. The first one I want to introduce here is actually a pretty simple one. It is called Eslint plugin JSX accessibility. And this is a set of accessibility linter rules that helps us check our React elements as we're coding them up. Now, this is a pretty low lift plugin to add to your code base, and that's because a lot of people already have some kind of a linter in their projects. And these linters help you catch common accessibility mistakes in your code while you're writing your code. You can even use this to automate through Git hooks and prevent inaccessible code from getting committed into your code base in the first place. And of course, you can use it in your CI/CD pipeline, and that will help fail any builds if there are errors thrown in your linter. And this is going to help prevent accessibility issues from making it into your production environments. Now, again, this is a pretty simple plugin. It's very low lift. Please feel free to check it out. It probably won't be too difficult to integrate into your own code bases. So I'm going to move on to the next one since this one is a pretty small one. So our next tool here is called Lighthouse. And this is another open source automated tool, except this one is going to help us run some accessibility audits against our website. And these audits are going to give us a better understanding of how accessible our website is. They also help to unearth any issues that we may need to resolve or any errors that really we have to go in and fix right away. Lighthouse comes in a few different flavors. My personal favorite is the Chrome DevTools version of Lighthouse, and that's because I use Chrome every day, so it's great that it's available right at my fingertips whenever I need it. But you can also use Lighthouse as a CLI tool in your CI systems, and there is a web UI available. And all of these do about the same thing. How you want to use it really just depends on your preference and your code bases. So for today, I'm going to talk about Chrome DevTools version of Lighthouse because, again, that's my favorite. And if we just run into the Chrome DevTools and head over to the Audits tab, we're going to see our Lighthouse tool here. We can check off the accessibility category in our audit and then hit Generate Report. And that's going to give us an accessibility score out of 100. And this score is going to tell us just how accessible our website is by checking if we're adhering to accessibility standards and any accessibility best practices. The audit is also going to give us a list of where we may have lost some points and how we can fix those errors in order to recuperate those points. I usually like to run Lighthouse in the DevTools, and I use that as a baseline just to understand how accessible my website is and where I can make improvements. I also like to use it when I'm making changes to my code base, and I do that just to make sure that I'm not unintentionally degrading any accessibility support. If I make a change, I'll go ahead and run Lighthouse. I'll check the score to make sure that no new errors have popped up. Or if there have been, I can go in and make sure that I fix them before I commit this code to master. An additional perk of Lighthouse is that it's not just for running accessibility audits, it also gives us audits on performance, best practices, SEO, progressive web apps, and all of this is rolled into one tool so that we can make sure that we're building a super top quality application without any additional work or additional tooling on our end. So it's all baked into one Lighthouse tool, and it's a really fantastic accessibility auditing tool. Now, from Lighthouse, we're going to jump on over to Reactx. And Reactx, again, is another open source tool, but this time it specifically tests the accessibility of our React applications. And again, it does display our results in the Chrome DevTools console. So taking a look at Reactx in action, we can open up our Chrome DevTools console and make sure that we have Reactx running. We're immediately going to see that Reactx has a bunch of messages that it's posting to our console. And these messages include some kind of severity rating, something moderate, minor, serious, and these are errors that have to do with our accessibility support. These messages link us to helpful resources on some details about the error in question and what we can do in order to fix these errors. Now, one pretty significant difference between Lighthouse and Reactx is that Lighthouse runs statically on your page load. But Reactx, you might notice, is working as I'm going through my website. I'm interacting with this website, clicking buttons, scrolling down, and you're going to see that Reactx is actually updating its messages and posting new ones to the console. Because with every interaction, Reactx is evaluating the accessibility of my website and letting me know where accessibility support has maybe degraded or isn't quite right. So you can definitely use Lighthouse and Reactx. They're both useful for different use cases. Lighthouse is for statically checking your website accessibility. Reactx might be good for something like manual QA, or while you're actually writing your code, you can make sure that things are working as they should be when you interact with your components. And then the last tool for the day, we have Axe Core. Now, Axe Core is a super powerful API for running automated accessibility tests and processes. And actually, a fun fact is that under the hood of Lighthouse and Reactx, the last two tools that we talked about, is actually being run by Axe Core. So the Axe Core API is going to give you full, complete control over the workflows, the processes, or the tests that you want to run. And this is really great if you want to run some super custom tests that maybe tools like Lighthouse or Reactx don't quite cover. Now, that's it for my tool recommendations. These are definitely by no means an exhaustive list of the tools available for your JavaScript apps, but they are definitely a really good start for making sure that you're thinking about the accessibility development processes that you have in place and where you can use some tools to automate these tasks. And I went ahead and included a couple of links to these resources, so feel free to check out the slides for those links to the projects. Now that we have our tooling out of the way, we can jump right into our testing. Very quick disclaimer for this. Again, I'm going to share the tools that I like to use, but the frameworks or the libraries here do not matter all that much. What I want you to pay attention to is what I'm testing and why it's important that I'm testing them. We're going to be covering the three most common types of tests that we have. We have unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. I will let you know what each of these tests are, what we want to focus on, and why they're important. So we're going to jump right into our unit tests. For unit tests, we want to make sure that we are testing the individual standalone components. And for these tests, we can validate that a component's API and behavior is as expected. A lot of times that means we're going to focus on making sure that our ARIA attributes are valid and that the values that they have are correct for the component's specific state it's in. And we can even test some keyboard navigation in our unit tests. And when we're testing keyboard navigation in unit tests, a lot of times we're going to be checking in on our component focus states. Here are the two libraries that I like to use. I'm partial to Jest and React testing libraries. So that's what you're going to see in my unit test and my integration test. But again, if these don't work for you, feel free to swap these out for whatever you like to use in your own code bases. We're going to start off with a very simple component, an accessible button. For my accessible button, I'm going to pass an accessible label. And this accessible label is going to be conditionally rendered as the ARIA attribute, ARIA-label. The ARIA label attribute provides a descriptive label for the element it's applied to so that something like a screen reader can announce it to users when it comes along to this button. So for my first test, what I want to do is make sure that my button has the ARIA label attribute if my accessible label is passed along to it as a prop. So I'm going to go ahead and create my accessible button. And when I create my accessible button, I'm going to pass along the accessible label attribute, accessible label prop to it. I'm going to go ahead and render my button as a node here in this test. And then I'm going to write out my assertion. So for my assertion, I'm saying that I am expecting my rendered button to have the attribute ARIA label, and that ARIA label attribute needs to be equal to the ARIA label accessible label value that I passed along to it. Now, this is a super simple assertion. All we're doing is checking to see if ARIA label is present and does it have the right value. But it really gets at the heart of what we need to know. And this is that if a screen reader needs to announce that this button has an accessible label, it's going to be able to do so because our ARIA label is present and it has the correct label associated with it. Now, we also want to be able to test that we only render that ARIA label if our accessible label is present. If it's not present, then we definitely don't want the ARIA label attribute to be in our markup. And that's because if we have an empty accessible label value and we render an ARIA label with an empty string, that means that our screen readers may not announce this button to our users, and that is going to provide a very difficult user experience for folks. So what we want to make sure we're doing is that we are not rendering the ARIA label attribute if there is no accessible label prop. The setup is about the same. We're just going to render our button, except this time we are not going to pass an accessible label to it. And then we're going to go ahead and render it as a node. And here's the assertion that we're going to be making. I'm now expecting that my rendered button does not have this ARIA label. And I'm doing that through the not object property and the to have attribute function. And this is just going to check that there is no ARIA label attribute set and no ARIA label value at all. Now, again, very small and not too difficult test, but it really does get at the heart of what we need to know. Is there an ARIA label when there should be? And if there is, then we know that our screen reader is going to be able to announce this button to our users. And as long as there is no ARIA label when there shouldn't be, our user experience is as expected. So another unit test that we can set up, but this time let's talk about focus. We can test that our components can gain focus, and this is a good way to test our keyboard navigation. All of our interactive elements need to support keyboard-only users, and only elements that can be focused on are interactive with a keyboard. So what we're going to do here is, once we've set up our accessible button, I'm going to call the focus method on my button, and then I'm going to set my assertion here. And now my assertion is that my rendered button currently has keyboard focus. Now, what does this test actually do? Truly, it protects us in the future from introducing bugs that could sometimes break keyboard navigation. By default, our HTML buttons support keyboard navigation and therefore can gain focus and therefore are accessible. But let's say that we swap out our button element here, and instead someone throws in a div, which is actually sometimes what we see in code bases. Instead of buttons, we have divs. Unfortunately, a div is not an interactive element by default. So this means that it will not be able to gain keyboard focus, and therefore our keyboard only users will not be able to interact with this button. So at this point, if we put that div where a button should be, now this is going to fail our test, and this will let us know that we've likely introduced some kind of a bug in our code that breaks keyboard navigation for our users. And again, these are the kinds of things that we want to make sure that we're testing for. We want to find those cases in our components that truly distills down exactly what the outcomes need to look like through an accessible lens. Let's say I have a component that's interactive. That lets me know that I probably need to check focus in order to make sure that keyboard navigation is supported. And if my components rely on some things like ARIA attributes, then I need to validate that those attributes are present and they are set to the correct values based on whatever the component state may be. And that's unit test. So let's move on to our integration test. And actually, what we just talked about through unit tests can actually be applied to our integration tests. The key difference here is that we're less concerned about component APIs and behavior and more concerned about the outcomes of how these components all come together and interact with each other. We can definitely still test for ARIA attributes and keyboard navigation, but this time it's within the context of multiple components coming together and working as a unit. So I'm going to take an example from the used React NYC website. On the website, we have a Slack signup form where we can submit our email address so that we can join our Slack channel. Now, you'll notice when I focus into this email input and then blur out of my email input, some sort of validation is run. And if there is no valid email address in my input when I blur out of it, then a red outline is added to the input in order to signal that I do need to add some kind of an email, and that's the only way that I'll be able to submit. While this is great for visual indication of an error, I also need to make sure that any assistive technologies like screen reader users are notified of this error somehow. And that's exactly what we're going to test here. We're going to make sure that my error signals also work for assistive technologies. Now, let's take a look at this component. You'll notice right away that this is composed of a few different components, and they're encapsulated in this container, which passes different props to it. We see here that I have an accessible input component, and this accepts an onBlur function. And this onBlur function is going to validate that email address to make sure that it is an actual valid email address. And I also have here an accessible alert component. And this component is going to be the one that handles any errors or different messages that we want our user to be aware of. Diving into our accessible alert component, we're noticing that this is a visually hidden component. And that's because this alert component is only for assistive technologies. It's only for our screen readers. So we don't need to display this on our browser. We also see that we do have an ARIA attribute, and that's set to alert. And this is the ARIA attribute that's going to make it so that our screen readers will announce any changes to this particular paragraph node. We see that there is a message value that we're adding to our paragraph node. That message is going to be what gets announced to the user when there is a change to this node. And we're starting out with an empty message because, again, only changes are going to be announced to the user. So when something gets changed in this message, that's when the user is going to know, oh, there was an error, or oh, something has just happened. So here's what we can do in order to create an integration test for our Slack signup container. What we want to know is that this component renders a visibly hidden alert on our input when it's blurred without a valid email address. we are going to render our Slack signup component and then get references to our accessible input and our accessible alert. We're then going to focus into our rendered input, and we're going to make sure that our rendered alert does not have any text in the message. And again, that's because we want this alert message to be empty, because only changes should be announced to this alert message to our user. And then we're going to run the blur method on our rendered input without having any kind of valid email address. And now that should trigger some kind of validation error in our message. So what we're going to assert here is that now our rendered alert should have a new error message inside of it that has changed. And that error message should be equal to the message that we passed to it. Now, this is a lot more moving parts than our simple unit tests that we wrote, but the guiding principles are about the same. We are still testing that our keyboard navigation is available, that the ARIA attributes are working as they should be, and we're making sure that these nodes are being updated when they need to be updated. But you're going to see that this focuses more on the different components that come together in order to make all of that happen, and not just keep it isolated to one single component. So from integration test, we can now move on to the full user experience of our website and how to test all of that holistically. And that comes with end-to-end tests. Again, we can use the same kind of evaluations from our unit tests and our integration tests, but now for end-to-end tests, we want to validate those within the context of our fully fleshed out user flows, our entire web pages, or our application as a whole. For my end-to-end testing library needs, I like to use Cypress.io. It's really great for browser-driven testing, and it also has really fantastic accessibility support. Again, Cypress.io has great accessibility support. It has one of my favorite things in here, which is the Cypress Axe plugin. And Cypress Axe plugin is very similar to Lighthouse and Reactx, in that it checks for accessibility errors in your app, but this time it's checking for those errors as it's baked into your testing suite. So it keeps all of that validation in one place, and it allows for really easy integration into your CI/CD pipeline. So let's try to write a very simple end-to-end test using Cypress. And we're going to go back to our Slack container and try to figure out what the user flow would be for that. So what I'm trying to validate is that my Slack container can submit an email address using only a keyboard. Remember, all of our interactive components have to be accessible using just a keyboard. So what we're going to do is we are going to query for our accessible input. And then we are going to simulate typing in a valid email address into our input. Then we're going to tab out of our input to the submit button that is in our component. And we're going to hit enter. And now all of that should be relatively what any user would do. They would want to get to the input, type in their email address, hit enter, and have it submit to the right place. So now we need to know whether or not that was actually a successful flow. And the way that we can do that is by checking our accessible alert. Because once we submit our valid email address, we are going to get some kind of success message. So what we want to do is query for our accessible alert component, and then assert that this accessible alert component should now have the text, email has been successfully submitted. And this is going to signal to us that, yes, through this user flow, our user was actually able to successfully submit this email message, this email address. That was pretty small, again, super simple. But it really does test the entire user flow of our Slack signup form using just the keyboard. And these are the kinds of things, again, that we want to be testing. We want to ask ourselves, how is the user interacting with my app? How can I translate those interactions into tests and therefore validate that this flow is working? And how am I doing all of that through an accessible lens? If we wanted to, we could also test that our user is alerted of errors like the way that we did in our integration test. But again, we're going to be simulating getting to our input, typing in an email address that is not valid, hitting enter, and then getting some kind of error message. Or if we wanted to write a slightly more robust test, let's say something on navigation, we could ask ourselves, what should happen when a user navigates from this page that I'm on right now to, let's say, the About page? What happens when there's a hard refresh? What happens if we're in a single page application? We can simulate all of that using end-to-end tests and then validate that the user flow is correct and will actually work for the folks that we're building these websites for. And that's it for testing. We have just covered the 3 most common types of tests: unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. We know now that unit tests are mostly for validating component APIs and behaviors, and we can check in on our ARIA attributes and our focus states to make sure that those components are behaving as expected. We can take those same kinds of concepts and throw them into our integration tests, but this time really focusing in on how our different components interact with each other. And then we can put all of that together and make sure for our end-to-end tests that we're validating entire user flows and making sure we're asking ourselves, how should a user be interacting with my website? And does it make sense that I write this test against it? So if we pull all of that together, we now know a few tools that can help prevent accessibility bugs from being introduced to our code while we're writing it, when we're committing to our code bases, and when we are shipping to production. We also know that these tools can help us generate some audits, and these audits will help uncover any kinds of issues that we need to validate in order to make sure that we improve on our accessibility support. And then we covered our testing tools and the kinds of tests that we can write. We wrote about unit test, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. We now know when to use each one and what to test for when it comes to each category. Now, this was quite a bit to cover in just 30-ish minutes. And there's still a lot more that you need to uncover in order to help create an accessibility development workflow that's going to benefit your projects, your teams, and your users. But if there's just one piece of advice that I want to leave you with, it's this. I know it can feel very overwhelming if this is the first time that you've thought about the accessibility of your products and are taking stock of the work that needs to happen in order to bring them up to standards and to create reliable processes around them. But it's definitely not expected that you have a fully accessible site or 100% test coverage on day one. You can make incremental changes where you can, and then consistently chisel away at the accessibility errors. And eventually, you'll be implementing those small changes, and they'll add up to possessing a much deeper and better understanding of what it's going to take to make your site accessible and how to make it resilient against bugs. And once you have that understanding, and we have our automation and testing processes in place, it'll be easier to make our websites work for everyone. And that means it'll be easier to build a better web for everyone. And eventually, you'll be able to say that you were able to do a lot of good without doing much of anything at all, sort of. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here and chatting with all of you today. If you want to take a look at my slides, please take a look at my website down below, or please feel free to hit me up on Twitter with any questions or hilarious memes that you want to send me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was, as I was expected, a great slides and talks. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have some question. Since we have very, very limited time, I need to
Yeah.
ask this question quickly. So the first question is that, automated tools cannot spot every accessibility issues.
Yes.
So perhaps maybe we should test on the real screen readers or different devices or different operating systems. So what is your opinion on that? What is your recommendation? And do you have any advice?
Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much for saying that. You absolutely cannot catch 100% of accessibility errors using just testing and automation. You can get a pretty good sense, maybe 60 to 70% there, but that's not going to replace manual testing. Definitely, you should be using screen readers. If you have an Apple computer, a screen reader is built into it. If you have Windows, there are a couple of free screen readers you can download. You can also just throw your mouse away and use just your keyboard while you're online or while you're playing with the apps that you're building. Really try to simulate what it will be when you need to tap into the accessibility tools that you have. So making sure that these are going to work, not just in theory through your automated tests that you're validating, but also in practice as the person that's actually going to be using them.
But don't you think like this is going to be a lot of work to do, perhaps? Like testing out all devices and things like that. Do you have any advice to kind of reduce this pain of testing on several devices, things like that, or perhaps the tools that we can run and see on all of them, something like that?
So there definitely are tools that do validation across different devices. If you use something like, let's say, Browser Stack definitely has a couple of those cross-browser, cross-device testing capabilities. So that will help you automate that in another way. But again, you'll only get about 60 to 70% there. You always want to make sure that you are manually testing in order to validate that your validations are correct.
I see. So some audiences says that actually they're using voiceover from the operating system, perhaps. So that could help. So do you have any experience with that or advice?
Yeah, VoiceOver is the screen reader that's built into your Mac. It's
Yeah.
not it's not an automated testing device or an automated device by any means, but you can manually turn VoiceOver on for your own computer, and then you can go ahead and listen to what a screen reader user would actually listen to and try to navigate your application using it.
Hmm. So another question is that if there is no automation tools or no automation and no tools, let's say, so what is the best way to start, um, for accessibility in your project? What do you do? Like, if you know there is no tools, for instance.
No tools at all.
Yeah,
So
just
no tools, that's totally fine. I mean, it's been quite a long time since we haven't had any automated tools, but don't forget that the web has been around for decades. And it was around before automated tools were a thing. So if you have no automated tools at your disposal, again, I would say default to manual testing. You can easily go into your Apple or your Windows computer, turn on your screen reader, and make sure that all of the screen reader announcements make sense in the context of your website. Or you can throw away your mouse and say, okay, I'm only going to use my keyboard for the rest of the day and make sure that my website is completely accessible through just this keyboard.
yeah, very good, very good. One more thing, usually when we come to like a team or maybe bigger, let's say companies, sometimes, accessibility is not the first priority, right?
Yeah.
So we need to go to some people and like convince them. So what is your approach if you go to a team and see, oh, this project doesn't take into account accessibility whatsoever? So what do you do?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I love/hate answering it because there are a couple of different ways to answer it. So first and foremost, this is what I always say. accessibility is for your users. It's for every single one of your users. If you don't build accessible websites, you're basically saying that you don't care about this group of people. You don't care about them, and that's just completely wrong, morally and philosophically. So, ethically, you want to make sure that the things you build work for everyone. Of course, that's not going to, let's say, convince your CEO or the person that manages the accounts and the money. So you can also say, well, accessibility is protected by law. In many countries, in the United States, for sure, there are laws that protect folks with disabilities and make sure that different companies have accessibility support baked in. So if your website does not have accessibility support baked in, you could definitely be sued and you could lose out on millions of dollars just because you didn't check to see if your website worked with a screen reader or was compatible with the keyboard-only user.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. That's true. So before we go to the next speaker, let me ask you the last question.
Sure.
So if, let's say, we have some audiences, or just imagine me, for instance, if I don't know anything about accessibility, before even I come and listen to your talks, so automating tools and etc.,
Yep.
where should I start with accessibility first? How can I read more or learn more about accessibility? What is the first step towards accessibility?
Sure. I'm going to take this as an opportunity to plug my old talks that I've done on accessibility. I have a couple of talks that are more introductory to folks that maybe have no experience with it. And they're very quick tips for how you can get acquainted with accessibility and very easy wins in order to make your sites more accessible. So if you want any info on that, check out my website, yuraima.com. And I have a few lists of talks that I've given. But I think the most thorough resource for learning about accessibility is the w3c.org website. This is the official www website. It has all of the information you could ever need on accessibility. I will say that it's pretty dense and it's a little bit difficult to get into, but once I got into it, you really do go back to it. It's got fantastic resources on examples and requirements. It's got different specs that you need to follow. So it is truly the resource for accessibility. It may take a little bit if you're just a beginner, which is why I recommend reading up on some maybe introductory articles or watching some of my talks. But that is what you ultimately will want to go to.
Absolutely, that's correct. So, great opportunity. You can visit Yuraima website, as well as maybe you can follow her on Twitter, perhaps. Yeah. Yes. So very good. And no technical question anymore. Last question before you go. Why not cats?
Cats are great too. I don't mind cats. Yeah. Send me some cat memes on Twitter. I love them. I don't see many cats out on the street. So I don't say hi to many cats. Although I will also say if there is a cat out on the street, I am going to try and pet it. So I guess cats and dogs equally. I love them both. I just happen to see a lot more dogs.
Yeah, perfect. So thank you very much for today. I hope to see you next time in Verona in person. Definitely. So have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
So, bye.